My name is Evan Accardi, and I'm with the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, C4ADS. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the recent work I've been doing using satellite imagery analysis and AIS data on Iran's illicit LPG ecosystem. The material you see today in the slideshow and during the discussion is also covered in part on the C4ADS blog site. So you can also find details of the case studies that I'll go over, some of which I can't go over all the details in the PowerPoint, so you can see some details up there that will be new to you. In addition to that, there should be more information from my colleagues and I on other areas of research in further sessions during this webinar series. So just a quick introduction to C4ADS. We're a 501c3 nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We use high advantage data and cutting edge tech to address transnational security challenges. Our sort of secret recipe to doing that is to bring together people, data, and tech. Our people are young, multilingual, culturally aware, tech-savvy analysts. We give those folks data that comes from a number of jurisdictions around the world, different sort of flavors of data, business data, tax, property records, shipping records, judicial registries, etc., across numerous languages, in addition to social media and geospatial data, as you'll see in this presentation with AIS and satellite imagery. And we sort of bring that all together with some of the most cutting-edge tech out there available on the markets. We have a philanthropic partnership with Palantir, as well as Windward, which is our AIS and ship tracking platform. And we're sort of unique as an organization because we really measure our success in terms of impact. To date, we have supported 71 designations from U.S. Treasury OFAC across 9 different sanctions programs. Our research products have supported the seizure of 3,200 tons of illicit contraband, primarily ivory, but also weapons and dual-use goods. And we calculate that we've disrupted somewhere on the order of $3.4 billion of illicit financial flows. And with that out of the way, let's get into some background information on the Iranian maritime sanctions evasion environment. On May 14th, OFAC, that's the Office of Foreign Assets Control, part of the U.S. Treasury, issued new guidance related to global shipping practices. The documents, which you can find online with an easy Google search, addresses global shipping practices in a very comprehensive way, and it covers like a range of geographic and functional areas. So important things to note about the advisory are very detailed descriptions of deceptive shipping practices. You can see those in the middle of the slide. Those have to do with disabling vessel AIS transponders, falsifying cargo documents, conducting ship-to-ship transfers, etc. As well as you get a very good look at OFAC and State Department's target audience for this information, which is the maritime insurance industry, flag registries, essentially any kind of actor that's on the front line of where sanctions evasion would occur. Those are the sort of community that OFAC and Treasury, OFAC and State are reaching out to as they implement new policies and as they really bring the hammer down in terms of sanctions on a number of states in the world. And finally, there's very detailed information about U.S. government sanction programs as they relate to Iran. The sort of 4 large buckets of sanctionable activity are having to do with 3 state-owned entities within Iran. That's NIOC, the state-owned oil company, NITC, the state-owned oil tanker fleet, and Irisal, the state-owned cargo shipping line of Iran. The next big bucket is the sanctioning of petroleum products, and petrochemical products. These aren't new. These went into effect November 2018 when JCPOA was fully in the rearview mirror. And so that's sort of general sectoral sanctions on those parts of Iran's economy, as well as purchases of those products from Iran, as well as the transportation of those products out of Iran. So beyond petrochemical products and petroleum products, there's also metals. Those are sanctioned products from Iran, specifically iron, steel, aluminum, and copper. And service provision category. So any vessels that are on OFAC's SDN list cannot be serviced by maritime actors. Doing so makes that actor eligible for sanctions. The most relevant example is vessel bunkering, which is sort of the industry term for fueling up a ship, either as it's at sea or like sort of adjacent to a port, in like an outer port waiting area, or even within port. So that's a really sort of key vulnerability of the Iranian state-owned shipping lines that state and OFAC are pursuing. So let's get into a bit of a case study here. This is a case study that details the application of satellite imagery to the maritime domain, and its applicability in addressing some of the shortcomings of AIS data. And I guess it's important to mention here, AIS data is ship tracking data. It originates from ship transponder beacons that are mandatory safety equipment on all ocean-going vessels over a certain size. Typically, they're just sort of for general safe navigation at sea. However, recently, that source of data has been tapped to get into some of the sanctions evasion investigations, sort of use cases that we use it for, as well as sort of more security-related use cases. So just to set the scene, this is, what you're seeing here is the PARS Special Economic and Energy Zone and the attached PARS Petrochemical Port. Where is this? This is located in Asaluya, which is an industrial town mid-Gulf of Iran. And it's really critical to Iran's petroleum industry as it's the location of a pipeline that comes onto shore here that feeds back from the South Pars gas fields. And that is the world's largest natural gas deposits, which is shared on the maritime boundary between Iran and Qatar, right there in the middle of the Persian Gulf. And so this facility handles natural gas purification, refining, produces natural gas liquids. In addition to that, it also handles container traffic and bulk exports of urea. And so this is sort of the area that we're going to focus the case study on with the satellite imagery. And just to sort of provide a little bit more context, this is Asaluya's airfield, about 6 kilometers southeast of the area you saw on the previous slide. Satellite imagery from June and July 2019 actually reveal that Iran's premier air defense system, the Russian-made S-300s, are deployed here at the airfield. For a little bit of context on that, attacks and disruptions on shipping activity in the Strait of Hormuz were really sort of ramping up around summer 2019. And the regime may have feared that that would be a time for retaliation against it. And I think the S-300s really sort of indicate that level of strategic worry or anticipation of retaliation on the part of the regime. And they sort of indicate how strategic a location this particular airport is. And my contention is that it's also strategic due to its proximity to the LPG exports that come out of here. So using daily satellite imagery from planets, I discovered what was essentially a glaring gap in AIS data. In this image, screening AIS data from this port showed a total of only 3 tankers visiting the port during the months of October and November 2019 combined. And using that daily planet imagery, we're able to see quite clearly that that's severely undercounting how much activity is going on at this port. In this single image from November 30th, we see 4 tanker vessels at loading berths taking on Iranian petroleum products. So that's, in a single day image, we're already exceeding the count that AIS would give you if you looked at 2 entire months. So this is a finding in and of itself. Basically, vessels over 300 gross tons are required to use their AIS transponders, and insurance companies have been instructed to screen AIS for gaps in data. And indeed, in that OFAC Maritime Shipping Advisory, AIS gaps and AIS misuse is a principal theme there. And this is case in point of why that's important. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to be focusing on sort of these 2 berths down here, marked in red. And you'll see some of the vessels that come and go out of these 2 berths. So this is the first example. I'm going to go through 4 of them. This is an image from November 14th. This is a 232 meter long, 37 meter wide liquid cargo vessel with a green tone and yellow highlights on its deck. And based on our observations, it was in this position from the 13th to the 16th of November. And using high resolution imagery really sort of pushes the limits of what's possible. And by extracting some of those key details about the size and timing of when it was at this port, that'll get you a pretty long way to identifying which vessel it is in the world. I'm not going to go through a full explanation of the methodology that I developed to identify ships that are dark, i.e. not using their AIS data, using satellite imagery. But so those are the sort of basic building blocks of how that methodology works: length and width, time and place, as well as a few other features as well. So the final step in that process usually comes down to taking advantage of some of the visible characteristics of the vessel. This is an image of the same vessel from the previous day. In this image, the ship is actually riding higher in the water because it's less laden. And that means that we're able to see the top side of the hull of the vessel. In this case, the hull is red, and there is white lettering at the top of the hull. And that lettering, it's only partially visible in this image, but you can see at least the L and the G in this image. So, that's sort of the final bit of identifying information about the ship can be extracted from visual evidence like this. And in this case, we were able to match up that vessel with a ground photo of the Sea Sapphire. And we know that this is the only vessel of the given size in the right area at the right time. And that bit of visual cue in terms of LPG written in white on the top side of the hull is the bit of information that puts us over the edge. And we would consider this a positive identification that we're sure this is the correct vessel. And once we have it ID'd, which is sort of the hard part, from there, you can sort of extract a number of insights into how it operates and who operates it. So within the last 180 days, the Sea Sapphire has made 5 port calls. These have happened in 2 ports in China, 1 port in India, and those are port calls that we consider high risk. That's why they're marked in red here. And they're high risk because they represent ports that the vessel called at immediately after loading Iranian LPG on November 13th through 16th. So those are sort of high risk transactions that occurred in Dongguan, China, Longkou, China, and Haldia, India. The port call following Haldia, India was back in Saudi Arabia at a place called Jaima, which is a part of Ras Tanura. And since there is no parallel sanctions program against against Saudi Arabia as there is in Iran, Saudi LPG is totally legal to exports. So that port call and the following one in Mundra, India, are low risk. Therefore, they're not marked in red in the graphic here. And so that's one variety of information you can get once you have the ship ID'd. Another variety of information you can get is the sort of commercial and human network that exists that operates the vessel. In this case, on the left, we see the corporate and human network of the Sea Sapphire as it loaded gas in Iran. And then it actually did something very clever, which is that it changed names, changed its identifying MMSI number, and changed its ownership and management companies as it was waiting near Hong Kong before it actually dropped off its first load of gas in China. So again, this is sort of a callback to that OFAC advisory about deceptive shipping practices, the altering of names, identifying information, frequent ownership changes, as well as taking advantage of flag registry services that exist through most any country in the world. Those are all methods that illicit actors take advantage of to skirt sanctions. And this is a great example of that happening. So in this case, the Sea Sapphire changed names to the Gas Coral. It also changed from a Liberia flag to a Panama flag. And in addition to that, the companies that are operating or managing or owning it, they changed from being one of them a Liberia registered company and then a Hong Kong registered company, and then after the change occurred, they were both Hong Kong companies. Meanwhile, the company directors are all Chinese nationals. So moving on to our second example, dark vessel number 2. This is a vessel that we observed at the adjacent port. This is imagery from Planet Labs. And again, we follow the same process of vessel identification where you measure it and then you see where and when you observed it. In this case, we leveraged that, again, the visual characteristics of hull coloring. In this case, it's a dark blue with white lettering at the top, and then red below the waterline. It's actually visible in the satellite image if you could sort of get a good look at it. Maybe this one's a little bit larger. And you can even see that red stripe below the blue on the top side of the hull. So in this case, we matched it up to the vessel Everrich 10. And for its parts, the Everrich 10 made only high-risk visits. In this case, also only Chinese ports. In fact, Everrich 10 dark activity where it would go dark, coming around the Strait of Hormuz, and then turn its AIS back on as it departed. So it's a fairly established pattern of how that AIS manipulation works. And because it's done that repeatedly in January, March, and May of this year, we note that all of these visits to these Chinese delivery ports are high risk. So in addition to visiting Asalia on November 14th, observations from satellite imagery also indicate that it was at the same berth loading gas on April 4th, March 1st, and January 28th as well. So again, these are sort of a small number of actors carrying out this illicit trade, and they all seem to be visiting Asalia without using their AIS systems. In the case of the Weiss, it essentially only makes one singular port call, which is a port in western India called Jawaharlal Nehru. And it has repeatedly called a port there after dark activity in the Gulf, and that seems to be its primary shipping route. And then finally, dark vessel number 4. This one is called the Clara. This was spotted by high-resolution imagery on October 7th, 2019. It is a Sierra Leone flagged LPG tanker, formerly known as Dolphin or OPEC Athena. And the vessel, so it's Sierra Leone flagged according to flag registry information services that are logged with the International Maritime Organization. However, on its AIS system, it is broadcasting with a Sao Tome and Principe MMSI number, which is one of the bits of identifying information that the vessel uses as it operates. So some sort of deceptive practice around the flag right there. For its parts, there is no known owner, operator, or manager of the vessel at this time. However, the prior owners and managers were Vietnamese companies, F-Gas Petrol Joint Stock Company, and Vietnam Gas and Chemicals. So Clara is an interesting case because, in fact, it has spent a total of 213 days in the past 365 not broadcasting AIS data. This should be a giant red flag to anybody that comes into contact with this ship, that it spends, more than half of last year dark, not broadcasting. That should be a huge red flag. And in terms of port calls, it's only made 2 in the last 6 months. Again, Dongguan, China, that's a recurring location, as well as a port in Vietnam. So a couple of high-level trends and takeaways here. Up to this point, C4ADS has worked with imagery from October 1st, 2019, all the way until May 7th, 2020. And we're developing a sort of trend analysis of how much shipping occurs out of this port over time, based on just accounts within imagery without IDing all the vessels. We noticed there's a pretty steady clip of about half a dozen to a dozen, all the way up to 14 in a single month. It's that many vessels exporting LPG from Asalia every month. And another interesting thing to note there is that it seems as though COVID not slowed down these exports. The rate of export is just as high throughout the months where Iran was really sort of bearing the brunt of the global pandemic. And that line of exports continues. Based on a bit of back-of-the-envelope calculation, I used the carrying capacity of a VLGC tanker and the contract pricing for Saudi LPG in similar months. I've estimated that every VLGC worth of cargo is approximately $30 million of revenue And there's even there's that bit of revenue, which is the market value of the gas. At least on the crude oil side of things, Iran tends to discount when it's under sanctions. So the same thing may occur for LPG. I don't know. And then there's also sort of the portion of those profits that go to the shipping actors that are taking on sanctions exposure risk to bring Iranian gas to market. So I don't know how the sort of $30 million price tag accounts for all those components. But in any event, it's a very large chunk of revenue for the Iranian government. And in terms of other context for that revenue, China, as part of its trade war with the United States, imposed a large tariff on American LPG exports. And news reports indicated that they were going to begin sourcing their LPG demand imports from other Middle Eastern countries, aside from in order to shift their imports away from U.S. manufacturers or U.S. producers. And articles did mention other countries in the Middle East. However, none of those articles mentioned Iran. Based on this information from satellite imagery and AIS, we can see that Iran is likely a principal source of them making up that gap in demand and supply. Although they were buying Iranian gas prior to tariffs as well. So there's this sort of trade war aspect to this particular ports and this LPG story. Another big takeaway here is just how transnational the networks involved are. We're talking about Iranian LPG import destinations so far, according to these 4 vessels, are China, India, Vietnam, and then Pakistan is also a destination. And the sort of corporate networks themselves touch jurisdictions like Turkey, Vietnam, Panama, Liberia, Hong Kong, and Marshall Islands. So we have the sort of state Iranian actors on one side, and then you have the consumer state actors on the other side, or sometimes commercial actors. And then there's this big sort of swath in the middle of shipping industry facilitators that are willing to take on risk of U.S. sanctions in order to make a profit by transferring and transporting Iranian product that's in all likelihood offers some sort of larger financial paycheck for them. And then finally, this is just sort of some of the ongoing type of work that we're doing. This is an example of what collection of high-resolution imagery on commercial vessels looks like. We're obviously adding more and more of these ID keys every day. And these are going to be extremely useful as we push this project into going after other ports of interest. We're going to our next steps after Iran are going to be looking at Venezuelan exports, North Korean imports, and we're collecting these ID keys as we go, so that in those cases where that imagery is just the final piece of data that you need to make a determination that it's this vessel or this vessel, we're going to have a library to work from and to be able to leverage in making those identifications. And obviously there's just so much talk in the geospatial industry these days about AI and machine learning. And I think this is a good example of some really analyst-dependent work on this problem set, IDing vessels, bringing together, fusing multiple data sources. And it's sort of the cutting edge of what an analyst can do that a machine cannot. Obviously, machines are extremely talented at IDing vessels under certain conditions, sort of clear skies, open waters. Those are sort of the easiest use cases for imagery-based objects identification. And this is sort of the other end of that, which is, where does a human need to be in the loop? What do they bring to the party? What is it that you can do when you fuse multiple sources of data and use deductive logic to identify nefarious shipping actors? So with that, I will say thank you very much for your attention, and we can open up for questions.
Yes, thanks a lot, Evan. We're switching over to questions right now as we speak. We actually had quite a few of them come in. And let's see. The first one we're going to go back to a little bit, just because you just talked about the database of IDs. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us if those database of IDs, that ship photo database, going to be open access?
Well, that's where I'd like to take it. Yeah. At this time, we're still really building the library. However, I think there is enough interest and enough value prop that it has that it really should be publicly available, or at least available commercially. So that is exactly where we'd like to go with it.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to see just like you mentioned, the applications for machine learning on top of that could be very, very incredible. But also just helping build that database from an open standpoint too, from other sources. That would be interesting. But to even go further, so from questions from the audience, do extreme weather events ever have an impact on counts and trends that you're performing?
Yeah, I think that's. I've done some work on analyzing traffic flows during hurricanes out of Gulf Coast ports, for example, Gulf of the U.S., of course. And yeah, I mean, it's a huge factor. Essentially, those are able to disrupt traffic flows for days, even weeks at a time. And that is visible at the port location itself. It's also usually visible in the sort of ship waiting areas where they all stack up, waiting to come into port. In some of those weather events, the safest place for a ship to be is out at sea. And those are where they congregate as opposed to coming into port. But yes, that's quite an interesting angle that I think is a clear commercial use that's not quite so security or strategic related.
When they try to protect themselves away from weather, you mentioned it's safer to be at sea in that situation and park it out there, or even just go further on route in open ocean. Do you find when they're parking, do they park near everybody else is more illegal, kind of trying to blend in, or are you able to identify them kind of off to the side, trying to be kind of isolated?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me talk about an example of some of the analysis we've done on bunkering. So ship bunkering, like I mentioned early in the presentation, is service provision of marine diesel, which is sort of low-grade, kind of dirty fuel that ships use to operate. And we see illicit actors taking advantage of really high traffic, really busy areas. So they will find out where ship bunkering happens in sort of large scale terms, principal examples of which are Fujairah, Singapore, and because there's so much marine bunker fuel being sold in those locations, usually by ship-to-ship transfer, that they offer really sort of safe ecosystems for illicit actors to penetrate, to sell illicit petroleum again, and to have their activities go more or less unnoticed in the large amount of transactions that are happening in a similar fashion in the same location. So it's a way to sort of hide in plain sight. They go to where that activity occurs a lot, and then they're able to do what they're going to do to violate laws and stay unsanctioned.
Excellent. Thanks for answering that. Another one here that kind of relates to a lot of the ports that you mentioned that ships jump between is do you have a trends? Are you anticipating trends of common high risk ports throughout the world, and where are some of those located? Common actors of high risk ports. Obviously, Iran's one of them, but what other ones that people may not even realize are countries that common ports of interest?
Yeah. So, basically our work at C4ADS really centers around sanctions evasion. So we're very attuned to those issues. With Iran as a use case, as a test case, the petroleum products are sanctioned, which means they're illegal to purchase, to sell, or to transport. And so it's a pretty clear industry to focus in on. That means the most at-risk ports are the locations of export of illicit products. So those are, Karg Islands, Siri Island, Lavon Island, Bandar Imam Khomeini, Shahid Rajai ports. These are all within Iran because it represents the source of those illicit products. In terms of other high-risk ports, you're talking about centers of demand. So, essentially, East Asia is the beating heart of demand for petroleum products in the world, and most of that is routed through Singapore. So, on the purchase side of things, ports in Japan, South Korea, China. Those are all at risk for purchasing Iranian petroleum, either knowingly, like is probably the case with China, or not being aware of the ultimate source of the cargo. And there's a lot of sort of intermediate transactions that can occur in Singapore, for example, where petroleum will be taken from Iran, comes to Singapore, is bought, and then resold. And that's one way to sort of hide its origin. So that's the sort of petroleum side of that. Iran is also exporting minerals and metals illicitly. So that's iron, steel, aluminum, and copper. So again, the places to look for are the sort of the hearts of demand for those products, which again, a lot of those are also in East Asia. South Korea is a big source of steel, for example, a big source of steel demand, I should say. Okay. And then there's, everywhere there's a sanctions program, whether that's the Iranian sanctions program or the DPRK sanctions program or Venezuela, there's sort of a web of ports that would be sort of most at risk for those sanctions programs as well.
Do ships typically park? Do you see them go outside of ports at all? I mean, obviously the ports have the equipment to offload and unload, but and obviously it kind of goes into maybe some of the bunkering a little bit too. But just completely spaces that have no ship traffic whatsoever off a coastline.
Yeah, actually, that's everybody's looking for the exact locations where ship-to-ship transfers are happening. Ship-to-ship transfer is a way to sort of remove port authorities from the transaction. So instead of delivering to a certain spot on land, ships will meet each other on the high seas. They will tie together, and then they'll transfer cargo over the side of the ship via their cranes, or in the case of oil, via hoses. And that can really occur almost anywhere in the world. And obviously the ocean is an extremely big place, and there's a lot of territory that would need to be monitored in order to catch that ship-to-ship transfer activity.
I want to get back to two things. Two primary questions I want to ask you from the audience here is, the first one is, can you do you touched on this a little bit at the beginning of your presentation, but a quick rundown of data sources. data sources use? You mentioned you of course use imagery, but can you talk about what kinds of imagery you use? And then you talked about AIS, but is there other sources that you bring in to help you figure this story out as you go along?
Yeah, that's sort of our bread and butter at C4ADS is bringing together different kinds of data from that would normally be siloed off in different by different providers or in different sort of buckets of technology, and so that's kind of what we specialize in. For this use case, we primarily used AIS data, and that was sort of to tip us to the fact that maybe there was not the proper amount of recorded information in that AIS data, paired with low-res imagery from Planet, high-res imagery from planets. We've also done similar use cases with Maxar imagery and black sky imagery. And then so that's sort of the strictly geospatial tech side of things. We also layer on top of that data from corporate records and shipping data. So a lot of our shipping data comes from IHS Markit, which is the global clearinghouse for data that the International Maritime Organization collects. So every time a ship is registered with the IMO is, of course, a UN-affiliated maritime safety organization. They collect data from everybody that registers a vessel. That data it goes to IHS. IHS structures it, records it over a historical time span. So we use that quite a bit as well. Again, corporate records from some of the jurisdictions involved, in this case, Panama, Marshall Islands, Turkey, and so on and so forth. So those are the sort of the ones we baked into this case study. Of course, there are always new types of information. Usually ports are also pretty good sources of information because a port has so many stakeholders that need to know about safety issues or traffic in the port or what have you. They're typically very helpful for learning about ships visiting a given port.
How long does it take you to pull together a case study?
So, it's a good question. So the actual IDing of the vessel can take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour and a half. And then from there, building out the case study takes longer because then you have to go out and collect these corporate records. You have to sort of tell the story using a screenshot of origin and destination. So when I put together an informative dossier or like informational packet on one of these ships, that can be 40 pages, maybe 10 pages of analysis and 30 pages of appendices, and that'll take somewhere on the order of 6 hours.
Okay, so do you use anything for general RF collection outside of AIS from different providers? Because there are, especially from some of the emerging space sensors that are working on that.
It's a good question. We don't currently use any of the RF data that's out there. We are looking to take more advantage of that. Obviously, satellite imagery is one method of finding out what happens when AIS goes off. However, collecting on RF frequencies is another way to fill that gap and can offer different kinds of information to sort of answer the question about what happens when AIS goes off. So the answer is not yet, but hopefully soon.
Awesome. Do you provide information to the UN through State Department, et cetera, about some of these findings, or do they come to you, or does that happen at all?
Yeah, so we are not, at least on the Iran side of things, we are not in touch with UN organizations. Iran's a little bit tricky just based on what parts of the international community are in support of sanctions. On a case like DPRK, where that sanctions regime is really on the international level. It's sort of written and imposed by the UN. In that case, we have been in closer touch with UN organizations. But for the Iran side of things, it's mostly the U.S. government.
Excellent. So I'm going to leave this as my last question. It looks like a lot of folks were coming in towards the end during when we got cut off and have a lot of questions going. But my last one is, I'm actually really fascinated with the beginning of your presentation when you were talking about the missile defense systems around the LPG ports in Iran. You mentioned the S-300 specifically. Do you know if have you seen any indications that they're upgrading those systems to the S-400 around critical facilities?
That's a great question. I wish I had an answer for you. I don't. I'm not following, I sort of see it as my place to talk about some of the commercial activities or sort of commercial adjacent, illicit commercial activities that are relevant to Iran. That's really sort of what we mostly focus on at C4ADS. There are organizations that do a very good job tracking down weapon systems and sort of strictly mill hard defense aspects of Iran. And I think I'm going to leave those for folks that are more qualified to talk about, those systems that have experience, that maybe have been in the military or what have you.
No worries. And I'm really more fascinated because sometimes a lot of protecting their energy supply goes hand in hand with their military. And if you're keeping track of key nefarious ports from a commercial activity standpoint, how much are they dedicating some of those defense platforms to other port areas that they're trying to transfer goods and services and perform this type of illicit commercial activity? So that's what I'm kind of curious about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always scanning imagery of some of the key port locations in Iran. So I've got my eyes out for them. But, I typically will tag in a buddy at that point to ask if, is this an S-300? Is this something else? But, we're certainly looking at those areas.
Excellent. Well, I know I keep saying this, but one last question. Looks like folks really want to know, because there's multiple questions on this same one. Do you retire government imagery or geospatial analysts, and what does it look like? Or is the organization hiring folks of that expertise? I guess people want to know what's the they're really interested in performing that type of work in the open like you do. So
yeah, at C4ADS, we're a nonprofit dealing with mostly very young, early career professionals. So on that side of things, we don't, except maybe to be a fellow, but those are pretty few and far between. In that slideshow, there's a little bit of branding from our partners at All Source Analysis. Our partners over on that side of things are developing a network of expert imagery analysts. So I think that would be a fruitful organization to get in touch with for anybody that is interested in doing some of this type of analysis in their spare time, or just to sort of, lend a hand in the expertise that they have developed over a long career in government, for example.
Yeah, and hopefully we can get All Source maybe online at some point to talk about that. But I can tell you specifically, they do have a network of we'll call it a network affiliate of they're trying to gain independent analysts to bring them into this network affiliate to compensate them for performing some type of analysis on their platform, et cetera. So it's worth looking into that as well. To answer the questions and finalize this conversation, I want to appreciate your time with us, Evan, and talking about Iran's illicit LPG ecosystem. We will take all the little choppy bits of our recording this session, and I'll put it together, do some video processing, and people can watch a complete unhindered view of this later, at the very least later today, worst case tomorrow. But all the links that you mentioned, we'll try that, get to the show notes. People have asked about website information for inquiring about more. We'll include that in the show notes as well. And if there's any further questions the audience has, feel free to send it to info@projectgeospatial.com or submit it into our Discord channel and ask questions there too. That's our Geospatial Frontier Discord channel. You're welcome to join that at geospatialfrontier.com. With that said, thank you very much, Evan. This is Project Geospatial with the Geospatial Frontier Virtual Technology Fair, signing off.